I'm David Bank. I'm the editor and CEO of Impact Alpha. How many of you know Impact Alpha? All right, that's good. I can save some of what I was going to say. I think let's just come on up, and maybe as I'll name you, and then you can each come up, and we'll do it in this order. So Smitha Das from WES. Welcome, Smitha. Everybody give Smitha a hand. And Carmen Correa from Pro Mujer. Carmen. And who's next? Joanna Kwong from Illumin Capital. And Adam Kiki Charles from the Equity Alliance. So I just want to name at the outset what everybody's thinking is, why is the white guy moderating the panel on DEI? And I hope it's because of Impact Alpha's coverage, long and consistent, and I hope compelling coverage that we've done across these issues for many years now. We have hundreds of stories in what we call the inclusive economy track. We jumped in early on gender lens investing, and also again on what we're calling the ownership economy. In fact, I've been schooled to mention that there's kind of an Impact Alpha track at SOCAP if you want to follow along with our coverage. My colleague Amy Cortez in the next session is kicking off the climate track, and our colleague Dennis Price in the last session of the day is kicking off the AI track. So you can follow Impact Alpha if that's your thing. And we've got our own panel in this track tomorrow, and I'm very excited to be premiering our first movie production, a 20-minute documentary that we put together over the last year called, in the program it's called Equity / Napoleon Wallace and the Reconstruction of Black Wealth. So it's tomorrow after lunch. And it kind of does bring together the themes, which is the ownership economy and Black wealth building and wealth creation to overcome racial wealth gaps and create true multiracial prosperity and democracy. One thing before we get to the panel, I just wanted to sort of set the stage a little bit. I got access to, and some others were on the call, where Bellwether Research laid out its survey results on this question of sort of messaging around DEI. And in fact, the first thing that we learned was don't say DEI, because DEI has been weaponized and actually polls very badly, but do say diversity, equity, and inclusion, which polls extremely well. And so don't believe the propaganda that DEI is not popular. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is extremely popular. The other part of it is that the inclusion part is particularly appealing to the broad population, and people sometimes get stuck on diversity, and mostly it turns out because they sort of think that means quotas of some sort, which I think we in this room maybe understand that's not what we're talking about. But don't fail to get to the inclusion part, which has broad and deep popular support. So with that, let's kick off, and I wanted to start with you, Smitha, and maybe I can just sit down. Does this work? Is this still working? Okay, that's much better, I think. So in a post on Impact Alpha, Smitha and Santos Ramdas, who some of you know from Gary Community Ventures, declared that we are, is this on? That we are on the cusp of an ownership movement. And what struck me is you said, making ownership of assets that appreciate in value more accessible, particularly for people of color, will dramatically reduce the racial wealth gap. So I just want you to sort of help tie the themes of this track together, which is both diversity, equity, and inclusion, and ownership. I'm going to make each of you like put in a quarter every time somebody says DEI.
Thank you, David. It's great to be with you all today and be back at SOCAP. It's a great homecoming to be with our community again. And to David's point, I think it's really exciting that we have this track, which is naming ownership for the first time at SOCAP. This is really indicative of the moment that we're in and the momentum that we're seeing in the ownership lens investing movement. I'll just start by introducing myself and organization. I'm Smitha and oversee investments at World Education Services. We're a global social enterprise that's looking to advance economic, social, and educational inclusion for immigrants, refugees, and international students. We're an interesting model where we're 100% self-funded by our products and services, and so that gives us the autonomy and ability to invest off of our balance sheet and align 100% of our assets with our mission. And so we're on a journey to align our capital with our mission, and as we did that and thought about how we can bring that values and mission alignment, we really thought about 3 key investment themes: investing in opportunity, power, and wealth for the communities we care about. So to your point about how these themes kind of relate, is as we were going deep into the wealth thematic and looking into the research, it's quite evident historically that the largest driver of wealth building across generations has been through asset ownership. Owning your own home, owning your own business, and wealth begets wealth, generation after generation. And so as we started thinking about how do we think about addressing the racial wealth gap, which is quite persistent, particularly as you compare it to the income gap, which is slightly closing, you start looking into how do you increase access to asset ownership, home ownership, employee ownership, financial asset ownership, community wealth building opportunities for communities that have been systematically locked out of those systems through targeted policies and practices, whether it's redlining, whether it's predatory lending practices or housing practices. You see that there has been systematic kind of loss of asset building opportunities for particularly people of color and migrant communities. And so we brought that intentionality to our investment approach to say, how do we bring a racial equity lens to asset building? And to your point, it's not just all assets. It's actually, importantly, assets that accrue in value. There have been a lot of stories, actually, about policies that have given access to assets, but those assets did not appreciate in value and perpetuated the racial wealth gap. And so to this theme, I'm excited that we have a whole track at SOCAP this year where we're talking about ownership as a mechanism to solve and address the racial wealth gap, and also connecting it to themes of diversity, equity, inclusion, and broadly impact investing.
Terrific, thank you. And Carmen, ProMujer has been a great partner of Impact Alpha. We've started a Latin America edition, and Carmen and ProMujer have been key to that. I just want to have you bring in what was always struck me about ProMujer. It's not only a gender lens, but also a very intentional effort to go what folks might call down market or down income and work with low income women in particular. So just tell us how you put that together.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Very happy to be here. Very happy to be part of this track. Basically, as you said, we have been working in Latin America for more than 34 years now, advancing gender equality and basically working with the low-income women at the regional level. We believe that if we support women, especially these women that don't have access to the needed services, they will be able not only to change their life, but also their surroundings, their families. They will be impacting positively in the communities. So we have been working in basically approaching them with a holistic approach, a comprehensive approach, giving them access to financial services, health services, and education. It's not enough to give them access to the needed money. Of course, they need the funds, but you need to teach them how to use those funds you are delivering to them. So education is key, financial education, digital education, because once you start delivering services in a digital manner, you need to teach them how to use those digital devices in order to be successful. Health, because if they are not in good health, they won't be able to achieve their full potential. So this is a comprehensive approach. You have to really get to know their needs. You have to go and listen. It's not enough to be designing a new financial mechanism from behind a desk here in San Francisco. You have to be on the ground. We have been on the ground. We have a huge presence in the ground, and that is what you need to deliver, actually, the proper services, because otherwise you won't be able to reach them. Last year, we made history in Latin America. We deployed the first gender bond, basically issued by a non-traditional bank, because usually this type of mechanism, these bonds, are issued by banks, big banks. We are not a bank. So we work a year with a regulator, actually, to change the regulation, so to access the capital market. We opened the door to other non-traditional issuers of bonds. So right now, organizations such as ProMujer can access the capital market in Argentina. That is a change. That is a change that you have to be there, you have to be working, you have to be investing, you have to be listening to the needs on the ground to actually deploy the right mechanisms.
I just want to underscore how important that is to be able to have access to the capital markets for low-cost capital and bring it to women and organizations like that. And I'm going to switch up the order just so we stay in the line here, Joanna, because the funding for Black-led startups, but also sort of share of assets managed by asset managers of color is not only abysmally low, but it's actually fallen in recent years since maybe the activity after the murder of George Floyd. And just so how do you see, and Illumin, as you'll explain, focuses a lot on this question of bias. So just tell us how bias plays out in up and down markets and across the sort of life cycle of managers and funds.
Yeah, absolutely. And definitely want to echo everyone. It's so great to be back in this community of like-minded and collaborative individuals. I know not one of us can just do this work alone, and it truly takes collaboration and alignment as a field. So going back to kind of the beginning, Illumin Capital is a fund of funds, and specifically a fund of private markets impact funds. And in addition to obviously deploying capital towards fund managers that are focused on impact areas like education, financial inclusion, sustainability, health, and what we call inclusive systems, which is investing in founders that are designing products and services for and with under-accessed and underserved individuals. For example, think Korean skincare, which I exclusively use. We are also supporting, in addition to the deployment of financial capital, in basically the social capital element that my co-panelists have all been speaking about. So our fundamental thesis is that reducing racial and gender biases can potentially drive and be related to financial and impact outperformance. So we do that by supporting our portfolio fund managers in reducing their own biases. We have a bias reduction toolkit and curriculum that we use to educate folks in terms of how to, one, identify bias, and two, what can you do once you've identified biases in terms of changing both your individual mindset as well as your firm processes in order to make that work sticky. And what David is referencing in terms of our research on bias is that when we were starting, long before 2020, we partnered with a social psychology center at Stanford that and did a real-life experiment with real-life asset allocators, where we sent out one-pagers and changed nothing but the photo on the page. So track record, education level, everything was the same. The only thing that changed was whether it was a photo of a Black fund manager or a white fund manager. And we found that these real-life asset allocators, who obviously didn't know what the experiment was about, were more likely to and more comfortable investing in the white fund manager than the Black fund manager. So proving a concept I think all of us are familiar with, but using data that race affects investor judgment. And actually one thing that was interesting was that at higher levels of performance. So when the fund manager had a positive track record, this difference, this disparity in willingness and comfort investing in the Black versus white fund manager was actually bigger. So it showed that that racial bias is actually coming out more during times of kind of market pressure and during actually times of outperformance. So as we've seen in 2020, 2021, a lot of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives kind of coming into focus, but then maybe some of that attention waning or folks moving away from it. We really want to be able to not just invest in emerging managers, but invest in those fund twos, fund threes, and really build kind of an ecosystem where we're building off of that positive performance. And we know from research that biases are defined as a shortcut that humans have used for hundreds of years to make decisions really quickly. And so during times of stress and during times of urgency, this actually causes folks to lean on biases or shortcuts more quickly. And so during times of market stress, like we've been experiencing in a down market, people are much more likely to do what they're already used to doing, to use maybe some of those proxies, such as institutions where fund managers have worked or where they got their education, or what they look like, or how they dress or how they talk, to make decisions rather than looking at the numbers, looking at that track record and slowing down and reducing their own biases. So I think for us, having a investment period long partnership that spans for the entire time that we've invested as LPs in our portfolio fund managers allows us to be at the table. And we actually reinforce this through a side letter that we launch during closing with all of our fund managers that commits them to showing up to doing this work to learn or unlearn in terms of showing up for the bias reduction curriculum, participating in the toolkit, participating in quarterly coaching sessions, as well as we host an experience called Impact Experience, where we bring folks to a place in the Deep South. Historically, it's been Montgomery, Alabama, to understand more about the racialized history in this specific country and kind of how our financial markets even got to look like what they look like today. And so all of this is kind of reinforced. You know, we're going to be an LP regardless if it's an up market or a down market. And so this is something where we're continuing to create that stickiness so that folks are paying attention to DEI, even when it's a time where you're much more likely to lean on your biases and kind of do things as they used to be. We're continuing to use data research and that transparency of collecting this data year over year to really encourage folks to continue making progress on that front.
Terrific, thank you. And Adam, what's particularly maddening about this persistent bias is that it actually flies in the face of opportunities and returns. And I know that Equity Alliance really leans into the thesis that by investing in undercapitalized, diverse fund managers and founders, you are unlocking access to superior returns that the rest of the venture market overlooks. So how do you square that? And the other thing I just want to say before you respond is, in that same research, as I said, the inclusion, the respect, the belonging messaging polls very well. What strangely doesn't poll with the public is the business case, which maybe does work in this crowd. But how do you put all that together?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And like everyone else, this is my first SOCAP, so I want to say thank you all for attending this panel and for being here. I'm really excited to be here as well. I guess I'll start off just by giving a little information on the Equity Alliance. So Equity Alliance was started by Dick Parsons. For those in the crowd who aren't familiar with him, one of a few black men to lead Fortune 100 companies. So Dick was the CEO and chair of Time Warner, then chairman of Citigroup, and founded the Equity Alliance really in reading a Knight Foundation study that I think it was 1.4% of assets under management, the 80 trillion in the US, are managed by women and people of color. And sort of seeing some of the issues that were coming out after George Floyd are kind of coming to the surface, how similar they were to some of the issues that he was seeing in the 70s, he really decided that he wanted to do something. So He founded Equity Alliance around this mission to democratize access to capital while delivering on superior returns. So the way that we're focused on the superior returns is we're investing in early stage venture capital. We're specifically focused on emerging managers, which historically have been shown to outperform their more established peers. And on the democratizing access side, we're investing in funds that are led by women and people of color. We also, outside of the fund of funds arm, allocate about a third of our capital to invest in founders, but we'll only back a founder if one of our funds has backed it already. To really get to your question, I think that one piece is, and this is sort of the theory that we have, when it comes to investing in diverse individuals, right? Currently, if you look at the U.S. population, right, 70% of the population identifies roughly as women and people of color, right? But the majority of that capital is flowing to the 30%, traditionally. So for us, it's sort of, if you have the same people all sort of like fishing in the same pond, it might make sense to sort of take a look in a different area, right? I think some additional layers, and I think this is really important in terms of some of the backlash that we're seeing. I think it's even more important, though, to make a more kind of full frontal case around the business case and returns. Another layer to our investing is that we are taking a thematic approach to investing. So we're really focused on investing in technologies that make life better for everyone. So we've got this one theme, we've got two themes. One is around human empowerment, so technologies that are unlocking human potential. The other theme is around future sustainability, so focusing on technologies that will lead to the preservation of our planet. And our take is that women and people of color have a unique perspective in those spaces, given their lived experiences. I think the deals that they are going to be in are going to be more competitive. And just to give an example, we invested earlier this year in a women's health company called Teal Health. It's focused on cervical cancer detection. The speculum that is currently used for providing those tests hasn't been innovated on since I think it was the 1940s, right? And I think in terms of understanding that issue, right, having kind of a focus on women, right, and kind of paying attention to this woman founder really kind of led us to that opportunity. In terms of impact, something like 50% of counties in the U.S. don't have an OBGYN available. So being able to deliver this test at home, it's not only going to be a great business case, because if you think about all the different women that are going to have access to that care, right, and have that built through insurance, but also the amount of impact that'll have in terms of detection. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. All right, so one of the things I really have loved about this ownership economy and ownership lens beat that we've been on is that it kind of changes the script in a lot of ways, from scarcity to abundance, from redistribution to what people are calling pre-distribution, and it really provides a way to think about bridging the racial wealth gaps and other things that, as you say, is not just sort of incremental at the wage level, but really kind of transformational. And so it's sort of a new narrative, and I want to engage you all on the new narrative even more broadly. Diversity, actually now I can say DEI because that is what's under attack. And there's been a very concerted, as you all know, sort of backlash, legal lawsuits, Fearless Fund, I think folks know about, to really roll back policies and practices, and it's having an effect. Corporations have backed off of it. People are scared to put themselves in the crosshairs. So I think there's all kinds of defensive things required, but there's also the need for a different narrative. And I sort of would love to engage each of you in whatever order you like on both how you're feeling that backlash and sort of how you're responding to it.
Yeah, I have a lot to say about this, especially with the election next week. And so I think something that we've been wrestling with is the narrative that you see in the media, and also realizing that that is a piece of the narrative. As you actually look into the data of what public companies are doing under the hood to change their practices, a lot of it is actually just the language and code switching that is happening on websites, even on the investor landscape. Shifts in language to say we're talking about inclusion, not DEI. We're saying sustainable investing, not ESG, right? There's some language evolution happening in the market, but I also think those who are committed to this work are continuing to do this work. We're just getting more strategic legally and smarter in doing it in coordination with others. And so I'm seeing this more and more, that there's more emphasis in rooms like this where we can actually hold hands and do this work together. For example, the Freedom Economy is a new institution that's being stood up. Many of those folks, leaders, are at this conference. We're members now at WES. That is a group that's looking more at the offense. How can investors be on the offense to think about the backlash against DEI and ESG? I think similarly around the narrative shift is moving beyond just the moral argument for this work. And we heard a little bit of this from both Adam and Joanna, right? It's not just a moral argument to invest in diverse managers or those communities. It's actually a very solid commercial business case. And so from that perspective at WES, we're also looking at how do we back leaders that have proximity to the problems that they're looking to solve? We fundamentally believe that they're better positioned to develop those solutions. And so that is something we're seeing in our portfolio. I think another shift of the narrative is also thinking about the systemic risk of racial inequality. And we're seeing organizations like TIP, for example, thinking about systemic risks on a long-term investment portfolio. So if we, for example, as asset owners at WES, want to be in the market and sustain the shocks of the system, we have to be integrating racial inequity as a systemic risk to our portfolio. And that's a different, again, a mindset shift for our board, for our team, as we think about integrating this beyond just the moral argument, which is, of course, imperative.
I totally agree. And basically, yes, the narrative is changing. And actually, there are misconceptions that we are working with and that we also have to clarify. One and the first misconception is that investing, for example, with a gender lens, it means that you are going to be investing in women-led and women-owned companies. And basically, it's much more than that. It's investing in companies that also have a very strategic and solid gender strategy and solid policies in place. It's investing in companies that also incorporate women in their value chain. It's also investing in companies that deliver products and services that will change the life of women and girls. And so we have to turn down these misconceptions that we have around, and that is the change also in the narrative. Another one is that you usually think, and I approach and state that many people come to me and said that investing with a gender lens means that they will have to give up some financial returns. That is a huge misconception because it is actually the opposite. When you invest with a gender lens, you will probably have much better returns. Actually, I'm always stating, this is a good business. Make the numbers. If you look at the numbers, you will have a very good number at the end. So basically, you have to think that if you invest with a gender lens, you will not only be investing in a women-led company, in a company that promotes gender equality, but you will be investing in the well-being of the whole community. That makes a change. And that is the change that we also have to seek in the narratives.
Yeah.
Totally agree with you. And definitely want to build off of kind of what you're talking about in terms of taking more of a holistic approach. And also, Smitha, what you were saying of like kind of walking the walk, it's all, you know, there's a reframing happening. We can use different language, but it's really about thinking about what we're doing And I think that there's a lot of possibility around creativity here. So some of kind of what Carmen shared around, it's not just, are we investing in women? It's like, how are you applying that lens to every part of the work? Do folks have a gender lens policy? Does it match kind of internally how employees are being treated, externally how, for us, we're asset allocators, so how are dollars going out the door, every part of that process, and then also, thinking about boards and kind of your power there. And I think for us, it's also about thinking kind of in terms of what's going to make an approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion sticky and move from just the diversity of representation. We measure this quantitative data year over year and really value that transparency to show the field, what is working, what's not working, but also moving towards more of the equity and inclusion. So equity being, are your processes equitable? It's not just about attracting one diverse hire, but really about how are you building your interviewing process or your process of building an investment pipeline to be more equitable. Are you using language that shares what your DEI approach is and why you're collecting DEI data earlier so that people feel like they're not self-identifying and like aren't trusting that that data will be private or putting themselves out there in a way that might affect their chances to receive an investment, and kind of building that approach or lens towards DEI into every single step of the process. I also think, to tie it kind of the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion to ownership, we're seeing a lot more thoughtfulness around the kind of financial incentives and mechanisms like carry. So a lot of emerging managers, we also have an emerging managers focused fund called our Catalyst Fund. We're seeing give carry to all people on their team as a way to kind of do more of that wealth building and to not just hire diverse folks, but really help them build a sustainable profession and career in the field. Another kind of way that we're thinking about embedding DEI into power dynamics is thinking about vendors. So often we're really focused on our role as fiduciaries in terms of where our investment capital is going, but we spend a lot of money on a lot of other vendors, data management, banking, et cetera. And how can you include a focus on diversity of representation or equity in your vendor process? We have a vendor scorecard, for example, that we use internally for all of our vendor searches, but we also encourage our portfolio fund managers to use as a tool to think more creatively and holistically about where their dollars that they're spending on vendors are going and whether that's also aligned with their broader approach to DEI.
Yeah, David, you started the question with how are we each feeling about the backlash, and I think it's important to start there. And for me, there's definitely a great deal of frustration that I'm feeling. Just 4 years ago, right? I think there was a much different tone around this space, and to see in just 4 short years how quickly, things have sort of turned around, I think is pretty difficult and challenging. But the thing that makes me hopeful is the managers that we work with, right? Despite the difficulty many of them are having at this moment fundraising, they're still finding ways to continue on and to support their founders. And so that's one thing that's really exciting. I think as an LP, something that I think we can do in this moment is really focus on the processes, as Joanna said. And also, I think part of this frustration comes from, for many of these managers, is that these are their first fund, right? Like they haven't even really fully gotten the opportunity to just sort of prove out their thesis and to prove out their chops. But I think what we can do is really lean into the data that we're able to collect. So one of the things that we are introducing in our next fund is we're requiring all of our managers to provide kind of additional data, not just on diversity, but their financial metrics. For us, it's really about being able to, over the longer term, make a case around why the strategy is not only sort of good business practice, but or from an impact perspective, but as a overall good business practice.
Yeah, I mean, let's get into that a little bit. And Joanna, I love the very practical steps, and I was going to ask each of you sort of what kinds of people talk about, do you accept cold calls from folks that you don't know already, which lets people in that may not already be in your network, or other things that you do to sort of put this into practice. And I guess the other maybe related thing is, if the data shows that diverse teams outperform, gender lens efforts outperform, emerging and first-time managers actually outperform, which everybody, many LPs will have policies specifically against that, then I guess other investors are leaving returns on the table at some level, and the flip side of that is that folks who are hip to these trends are actually able to get out performance. Maybe you don't want actually all these other investors to come in and mess up the market in some way. But just talk a little bit about like specific practices that you use in your firms. Joanna, you already shared some, so if you have more, that's fine. But other folks have.
There's actually an Impact Alpha article we wrote about how we're shifting our practices to be more trust-based. And I would say, just to echo some of the comments from my colleagues, is that, if you're only thinking about who you're investing in or what you're investing in and not changing the how, ultimately practices are sticky and capital will continue to not flow where it should. And so we are unlearning at WES on how investments have been made, how we can design a practice which is naming power and aiming to shift power to those who are more proximate to community. And so we coined this term around trust-based investing, and we have 6 practices that we think about, from how we are looking to redefine risk in our underwriting and looking at alternative track records. We actually have a partnership now with The Real, which is part of RIA Ventures, to kind of rethink due diligence 2.0. So maybe actually next SOCAP we could share some learnings from that. We're taking stock of what happened with due diligence 2.0, which was a really great call to action in 2020. But really nothing happened since then, so we're reconvening that group who pledged and taking stock to see what could a due diligence 3.0 look like. But just practices like that, right, that are helping individuals and institutional investors, importantly, redefine risk and shift some of those underlying practices. And so we have several other practices, and maybe I'll plug Impact Alpha as a place to learn more.
Great.
Yes, in our case, as it was stated before, we are always trying to listen what's needed out there. And for example, when we implemented ProMujer Digital, this is a digital tool to provide financial services, we started actually with a KYC with emails. Suddenly, only a few women were applying to loans. Why? Because most of them don't have an email. They use a phone. They have a phone number. We needed to change that. So it's adapting to really what's the need out there. You have to, as said before, start listening. And the other thing is we need to partner. Because if we don't partner with other players that actually can deliver, can work with us, can instrument or work on the definition of a new financial instrument or a new educational service or a new way of providing a service, we won't be able to advance. We are working very much in silos. We don't have to be working in silos. We have to be working in a cooperative manner, working with the private sector, the public sector. Civil society has to be on the table, and the beneficiaries have to be on the table because they are the ones who know what they really need.
I'll just put in a plug for Carmen Correa and ProMujer. Actually put that into practice with your own event and bring all those folks together.
Yeah, each year we organize the GLI Forum. This is a very big event to promote gender lens investing in Latin America. This year it took place in Buenos Aires, Argentina. We more or less 1,000 attendants, and basically we bring in to the event most of our beneficiaries. So you will have a very big fund manager sitting in the same table or in the same panel as the beneficiary, and they will be sharing their experiences from both sides of the table.
Yeah, so David, to your point in terms of cold outreach, one of the things that we did, well, there's 2 things. One is really around kind of folks getting access to us and kind of initial introductions. So what we've done is we created an intro form on our website for any emerging manager that is interested in being evaluated for an investment. What that does is two things. So one, it's an entry point for anyone, but then two, it ensures that we're collecting the same data across anyone that we encounter with. So before anyone can move forward in our process, that's now a requirement. The other thing I think really relates to transparency, and this is something that we're increasingly working on, and it can be challenging, I think, as an LP, but even on our website, we've just made it very clear what we're looking for. I think that's like a first step. Something personally that I am increasingly trying to do as I'm engaging with fund managers, it could probably feel a bit like a black box in terms of what's working in terms of my approach and strategy when it comes to my fundraise. So one thing I'm really conscious of is trying to provide some feedback. Particularly if I feel that individual might be receptive to it, because there are so many subtle codes or cultural like reference points, I think, within the venture space that folks might not know. And if they don't have someone else to sort of key them into that or provide that feedback, right, even if it's not an opportunity for us, I want them to be able to move forward and still have left feeling as if something in terms of their approach has improved.
You mentioned personally, and I wanted to go there, and I didn't really prep you on this, but the panel this morning at the plenary, when people talked about their origin stories, and I wonder if each of you would just share some moment that sort of set you on your path, or that was important to you in terms of getting into this work, if you can reach back.
I'm happy to start, and I also quickly wanted to just build off of something that Adam said, and I think that I can tie the two together about kind of that relational element. So I think kind of, this whole conference, it's about financial capital, but also social capital. So I think there's a lot of power in, if you're in an asset allocator seat, kind of extending that social capital and those connections to folks in a way that's authentic. And one thing that came to mind for me was, for our impact experience, we bring our GPs and our LPs into the room together, but often there's not even a name tag that says where they work or anything, so it's very much focused on who you are as a person. And that also relates to my origin story, because for a lot of folks, our impact experience, which is based in Montgomery, Alabama, is maybe their first time to the Deep South. For me, the reason I, as an individual, want to do this work, on top of my lived experience being the daughter of Chinese immigrants, was that I do feel like I grew up in a very privileged way in terms of a lot of educational opportunities I had. I was in an undergraduate scholarship in college that obviously paid for me to go to college, which was amazing to graduate without student debt and to be able to do impact-focused work from my very first job. But the reason I wanted to work in impact capital at all was that I lived and taught for a summer in the Mississippi Delta at a freedom school as part of my undergraduate scholarship. And for me, that was the first time that I experienced living in the Deep South. And my education around racial inequity in this country growing up in New Jersey was very different from living it and being and working in a town that was still segregated down the middle, where all of my students were Black, but across the railroad tracks were all of the kind of nicer homes that were all owned by white folks. For me, it was really powerful working at an organization that had incredible outcomes. Most of my students were the first in their families to go to college, and seeing that our operating budget was so lean. So I was thinking, my dad worked on Wall Street, I know there's a lot of money out there. Why is it not being allocated towards amazing organizations like the one I was working at that have incredible outcomes? And so I wanted to do something about kind of that divide between the dollars out there and what's considered an impact in the market today, and how we can get impactful capital into the hands of people who are also from that community, rather than me being an outsider coming in and kind of telling them or gauging what is considered impactful.
I started my career working at the Inter-American Development Bank in the microfinance sector. I never imagined I was going to end up being the CEO of ProMujer, but for sure it was a very good school. Besides that, I started the operations of Endeavor in Uruguay, supporting high-impact entrepreneurs in the country. It was quite an experience because nobody was talking about entrepreneurs. Nobody even gave value to entrepreneurship. And we changed the whole ecosystem. We developed the supporting ecosystem for the local entrepreneurs, the regional entrepreneurs, where while we were working with various entrepreneurs, very high-impact entrepreneurs that are very much needed, but a lot of entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, very small entrepreneurs were approaching us, and we were not able to support them. So that kind of make a click, and actually, I have been involved with the sustainable development for many years. So when ProMujer came up, for me, it was a very good opportunity to be working directly with women entrepreneurs, supporting those women that really don't have access to any type of services, that usually you don't choose where you are going to be born. So actually, we have a responsibility to support them because they haven't chosen to basically be where they are. In most cases, they are where they are because they haven't had the opportunities. So everybody here has a privilege because being here is because you have actually have access to an education, you have access to certain things that many people out there haven't. So I think we have a huge responsibility to be supporting those that really don't have access to the services they need, and we can provide them.
Yeah.
I can maybe speak a little bit. I don't know that I have a specific origin story or event, but maybe even thinking more broadly, for me, and a lot of what Carmen just said around access resonates because both my parents are immigrants to this country. I think, in terms of my lived experience, a lot of it has been sort of existing between spaces and needing to kind of figure out how to translate for myself or translate for others what's going on, what information is critical. Perhaps even just thinking back to, this is like 15 years ago when I was an undergrad, something that got me really excited and maybe ties me to the work now is I noticed that the student groups, the affinity groups, the ones that were oriented around students of color or from, different ethnic backgrounds were receiving less funding than other groups. So even in kind of that microcosm, and for me, it made me decide to sort of run to be on that the undergraduate finance committee. And what I realized in that experience was it really was just a difference in terms of access to information, knowing how to sort of present yourself and how to make the case for funding. I know that the issues that we deal with now are more complex than that, but sometimes I just try to break things down to sort of that base level, right? In terms of really trying to figure out, okay, like what's the disconnect, right? In terms of why certain folks might be able to access certain opportunities and others might struggle.
Just before you go, I think that we're going to go to Q&A. So I don't know whether there were cards circulating around. How we're going to do this? Are there some cards? So we'll get to that after Smith. Oh, good. And if you have more questions.
I would say for me, a lot of your stories resonate with different parts of my story, but I grew up in Arizona as one of the only immigrant families in my neighborhood, one of the very few people of color in my high school and just grade school, and so I was just kind of very hyper aware of my positioning and othering in the life that I lived, and I would say through the spaces that I've been in have always tried to find moments of connection with other cultures or communities, and that bridging that you're talking about resonates a lot. I think even the cultures of being an immigrant, kind of a daughter of immigrants from India, and bridging cultures between the American culture and Indian culture, modernity and tradition. I think that is the in-between spaces I tend to sit in, and now in the work that we do, sitting in between kind of community and capital markets, and how do we start bridging those gaps, or some of the code switching and translating that needs to happen in that space as well. And so a lot of your stories resonated a lot. I think also deeply familiar with how important ownership and asset ownership is to a wealth journey. It was such a seminal moment when my parents were finally able to buy their first house, and what that meant as a way for us to participate in the American dream and that kind of vision. And so, but then also how the 2008 crash really lost a lot of the value of that asset. So again, back to the important point that you need to be investing in assets that accrue in value, in markets that are resilient. And so I think that's where, for example, Arizona was very much hit during the housing crash, and we felt those shocks as a family. And so just very, very much familiar with that. And I think to that point, we really try to build a team that has lived experience in the problems we're looking to solve, because it makes our work better.
Great. Okay, so this is person didn't put their name on this, but the question is particularly for Adam and Joanna as fundraisers, and I think also as LPs. In my experience, a small group of LPs believe, as you do, that investment excellence is broadly distributed, but capital is not. But many have no incentive to do anything different or innovative because that would involve career risk. How do you find LPs whose views and values are aligned with yours?
Sure, I'm happy to go. I think, so our first fund we were raising prior to the murder of George Floyd, and a lot of people waking up or reawakening to racial inequity in our country. We definitely saw a big shift in interest after June 2020. And I would say our first fund was very much wealthy individuals and family offices that have a little bit more flexibility in terms of the kind of investments that they could make. And we put a lot of effort in our second fundraise to be more institutional ready. And this is also something that our amazing COO, Katie, works a lot in partnership with our portfolio funds on, in terms of supporting them on how they can be more institutional ready. It's something a lot of funds are thinking about. And so with more of kind of our fund one under our belt and some of the impact track record in terms of things that we did, processes we implemented in partnership with our portfolio fund managers, we were able to go out and raise a second fund with a lot more of those kind of policies in place that made us more attractive to bigger institutions. That being said, obviously not everyone is aligned with our vision. And so for us, I think it's really that data and accountability piece of trying to also be a proof point to show through our work that this work of reducing racial and gender biases can actually be supportive of financial performance. So we really see ourselves as a pilot there. That's also why we're so rigorous about collecting both quantitative and qualitative data. And I think in terms of like that value add to LPs, a lot of LPs, even if it's within the backlash to DEI, they're trying to think more about how they can do due diligence in a way that's more thoughtful, more equitable. Maybe it's not just focused on diversity of representation, but that's something where often they're coming to us to ask those questions. How can I really get under the hood of what's happening? How can I ask questions about ownership, carry, et cetera? And I think for us, that's a place where we've been able to be a value add. And also, we're just in a position where we feel really fortunate to have a little bit more power to say no to institutions that are not as values aligned.
I think 50% of the battle when it comes to fundraising really is network, right? And so for us, I think it's probably two things. So for one, I know Claude and Darren recently met, right? And through sort of building that relationship, I think we'll sort of share who are folks that might be good LPs for either of our organizations. But I also think it's in the relationships that you build with your existing LPs, right? Like-minded folks tend to know other like-minded folks, right? So, even throughout our raises, I think a lot of introductions have come from folks who have already backed us. I think we all know that at this stage, particularly in this environment, fundraising is not for the faint of heart. But I think it is finding sort of folks that work at similar organizations and really sort of starting to believe, or really kind of leaning into the fact that the pie is big enough if we work together. I think that's the philosophy that we try to take.
I'm not sure we're going to be able to get to all of these, but here's one that's broad and open-ended for each of you, or for anybody who has an example. Can you give an example of when you changed somebody's mind on diversity, equity, and inclusion? What worked and what didn't?
I think a lot of it is understanding your audience. And so for some individuals, the statistics, the Knight Foundation study around the fact that of the $80 trillion in U.S. capital markets, only 1.4% are flowing to people of color and women, right? Sometimes the statistic, kind of for those analytical brains, is helpful, or some of the research, of course, Illumin has done. I think for others, there's that story around what is your relationship, for example, with ownership, and starting there and making it personal and then broadening, because often a lot of this is changing the hearts and minds individual by individual. And so I think as we talk to several peer potential LPs of these funds, and also just other actors, even across West, for us to really double down on this strategy, it is often meeting people where they are, right, in that relationship and speaking that language. And so I think that's where we've, particularly with this concept of diversity, equity, inclusion, with the concept of ownership lens investing, it has so many facets to it, right? It's not just a tool for wealth building, but it's also a tool for power shifting. It's also a tool to address racial equity. It's also a tool for just better inclusive economy and better quality jobs. So for some people, we use the language around quality jobs for employee ownership. And that language really resonates with investors. So I think part of it is understanding the solutions, but then also translating it to the right stakeholder. And that's been effective to bring people along.
Right. Anybody's mind changed?
I think we are asked to wrap up.
Okay, then very quickly, one last sort of call to action. Like what is next, what is needed in maybe 6 or 8 words. 10 if you want.
Diversity, equity, and inclusion should be, we should think about how inclusive we should be. And as said, we should be working with the different sectors. We should be wrapping up the agendas, consolidating the agendas of different types of organizations. We have to communicate. We have to basically be working much closer with each other.
I think we know that we're much more reliant on biases during times of stress and market pressure. And so we need to address also that survivorship bias by continuing to invest in managers and asset allocators of color and women, and also women of color, in terms of both financial and social capital, in terms of making those connections to values-aligned LPs.
I would ask that everyone build awareness around their own privilege, right? Whether it's educational or based on whatever position you hold or some aspect of your identity. I think there's a lot of positional power that you might have as a potential ally to someone that is in a less privileged position. So as you're making decisions or moving through your organizations, I think just encouraging folks to continue to build awareness around that.
I would say, particularly given the rising backlash, I think now is the time to step into your leadership role in the field, to double down on this strategy, and also be strategic. Be strategic legally, be strategic in your communications, but continue the work.
leadership is a great way to leave it. And join me in thanking these people for their leadership and all of you for your leadership.